provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Friday weekend edition, but before we get into some of the conversation, which we'll be having in about a half an hour with Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter, of course, we'll be talking about the impeachment trial next week. We'll be talking about the issue of election reform, some very interesting questions that have been raised about some of those individuals serving in the Biden cabinet, and even a governor deciding to maybe declare war on big tech. So we've got lots to cover. Not to mention some of the religious liberty victories that Kelly Shackelford will be sharing with us. But if you're with us on many of these Fridays, you know that one of the things we've been wanting to do is work our way through many of the chapters in a book by Dr. Doug Groothuis, Philosophy in 7 Sentences. And we've managed to really look at quite a number already: Protagoras, Socrates, Aristotle, Augustine. Today we get to Descartes, René Descartes, and an individual that probably more jokes made about this philosopher than anybody else, more lines as nothing else. You know, of course, I remember Moody Blues, I think, therefore I am, I think, you know, all sorts of lines like this. So, and walking into a bar, and you've heard them all. Or if you haven't, we might cover a few. So we're going to do a better job of trying to give him his due. And if you're not familiar, Doug Groothuis, of course, is a good friend of this ministry. We had him on decades ago when he first started writing about things like Unmasking the New Age, probably his seminal book that I'm looking forward to seeing that will be revised on Christian apologetics, a comprehensive case for Christian faith. Many other books on Pascal, on truth decay, and the rest. Received his PhD from the University of Oregon and joins us now by phone. Doug, if nothing else, poor René Descartes maybe needs an anti-defamation league to help him out, because he probably gets more jokes made about him than any other philosophy that I can imagine.
Well, I think so, and I want to join that league because I think that he has been, unfortunately, there are a lot of caricatures that have been made about him. He's blamed for just about everything. He's blamed for separating the mind and the body, and for the idea that we have to be totally certain about anything to know it. And so he is the engine of skepticism. He's the engine of not caring about the environment, because all you can know is your mind, and the environment is just a mechanism, has no sacred value. We could go on and on and on. But,
it's a long list.
I'm not,
yeah,
it is.
You know, and what's so interesting is if I were to go out right now with a microphone and talk to some of the people even in this building and say, okay, René Descartes, what's he known for? More than some of the other philosophers we talked about, a lot of people might come up with, I think, therefore I am. But then if I ask the next question, what does that mean? People start staring at their shoes and go, I have no idea. So in some respects,
right,
it gets us into, can we use a big word, epistemology, this whole idea of knowledge. Can you kind of help us through that? Because as you have pointed out, each one of these philosophers, we have a sentence associated with them. I think, therefore I am, may be familiar. But again, if you ask people to understand what that means, that gets you into a whole different conversation, doesn't it?
Right. Well, what I want to do in my chapter is to say that Descartes' quest is a legitimate one. He was trying to find knowledge in an age of a lot of skepticism. People were wondering about religious authority, and they were wondering if they could really know much of anything. At least some people were wondering that. So
yes,
Descartes tries to find the one thing that he can't be wrong about. So he could think there's a world out there, and in fact, he's just dreaming, for example. Or he could think he has a body, and he really doesn't. He's somehow deceived. But he gets down to the fact that he is thinking. He has thoughts. And so he realizes that if he is thinking, there has to be a thinker. So the idea of thinking and thinker are correlative. You can't have one without the other. That's really his starting point in his philosophy. Now, you don't have to start there in philosophy, but he wanted to find something that he absolutely could not be wrong about, and I think he got it with that one. If you have thought, you have a thinker.
And again, back to your point about uncertainty, I mean, that was really developing there in the 16th and 17th century. It's certainly part of what we'll be talking about here today in the 21st century, because you do have people that wonder, especially in the Eastern world, if there's any reality out there, whether it's all an illusion, a Maya, and those kinds of things. And then you even have people that buy into, and this borrows heavily from your book on truth decay in postmodernism, wondering if anything is true or whether everything is an opinion. So even though some people might say, well, he's kind of a philosopher from a few centuries ago, some of the things he's helping us with are relevant even to our day-to-day lives right here in the 21st century, aren't they?
Well, I think so, because people will say things like, you can't know anything for certain. And, of course, I want to say, do you know that for certain? But then I'd also say, hey, there are some things you know, like if you're thinking, then you exist. You can know that. And we want to use our thinking to get to the truth. Also, when Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, that's true whether or not anything is out there in the external world. You know that's true. Whatever else may or may not be true. And that actually refutes a philosophy called empiricism, which says that it is only through the senses that we come to knowledge. But you can come to some knowledge simply by thought alone. You don't want to leave it there. And Descartes did not leave it there. But just with that one statement, he shows there's at least one thing that is necessarily true, and he shows that empiricism is false. So that's nothing to scoff at.
Let's see if we can go on from there, because then, in addition to this kind of starting point, you have, if you will, what you call kind of a 6-stop journey in the meditations. And I thought we might start that, and then maybe even after the break talk about a little bit more. But as you said, he didn't stop there with, okay, now I've solved all my philosophical questions. In some respects, that was the first step, wasn't it?
Right. So he even posits the idea that there's some evil demon out there who's trying to trick him about absolutely everything. And he says, well, even if he is all powerful, this is just a thought experiment, he couldn't trick me that I'm thinking. And if I'm thinking, then I exist. And then he makes an interesting move. He says, one of the thoughts that I have is a thought of an infinite being, that is, of God.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks of other beings, like, let's say, a rock or a tree or a frog or a person. And then the big difference with the idea of God is that God is infinite. So God is omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, omnipresent, present everywhere at the same time. And Descartes says, where in the world did that idea come from? And he says it's not an idea like a tree or a rock. Those are ideas of finite things, limited things. And it's not an idea like something I made up, like a unicorn or something like that. And so he says, where is the origin of this idea that is in its own separate category, the idea of infinity?
Yes.
And what he argues, interestingly, and this I think is a much better argument than some philosophers take it to be, but what he says is the only adequate explanation for the idea of God is that God gave me the idea of God. So maybe after the break I can go through that.
Yeah, we'll go through that because I think it's very good. Where did the idea of God come from? And we'll come back and continue our conversation with Doug Groothuis right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Representative Dan Crenshaw started his commentary about lockdowns, but quickly focused on how our brains process risk. He wanted to help us understand why Americans see the pandemic and the lockdowns very differently. He cites research that discovered that Democrats and Republicans differ in their neural mechanism activated during risk-taking exercises, specifically in the amygdala region. This demonstrates measurable physiological differences when confronted with risk. For example, conservatives overwhelmingly fill the ranks of physically riskier jobs such as the military, law enforcement, and loggers. What does this mean in terms of the pandemic that we faced this last year? Well, conservatives are less risk-averse to physical threats and less likely to favor more extreme actions to mitigate risk. Liberals, he argues, are more likely to believe that government can solve problems and are willing to accept such measures. He also quotes from research by Dr. Jonathan Haidt, who's been on my radio program to talk about his latest book. He found that liberals overemphasize caring and fairness above other moral considerations. Conservatives favor these moral categories, but also value moral authority and tradition, liberty, and loyalty. And this also explains why liberals routinely denigrate contextualized COVID-19 data, such as accounting for age and comorbidities when assessing fatalities, because they see this as downplaying the virus. If we're to have a civil debate about the responses to the pandemic, then we need to understand the differences between us and frame the discussion accordingly. Representative Crenshaw wisely reminds us that some of the differences we have about government policy are affected by how our brains process risk and emotions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Dr. Doug Groothuis as we talk about his book, Philosophy in 7 Sentences. We're talking about René Descartes. And Doug, you know, as we were talking about where did this idea of God come from, it's reminiscent of a quote that I use occasionally here on Point of View from C.S. Lewis, who said, you know, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. And so there is a sense in which, as it talks about in Ecclesiastes, that we have eternity set in our hearts. And it does seem to me that this is one of the points that Descartes is bringing up. I can think about other beings and other things, rocks and trees and dogs and cats and humans and horses and iPods and whatever, but somewhere this comes not from my imagination, but from the argument that maybe there is a God who gave me this idea in the first place.
Well, that's what he's arguing. And when you mention C.S. Lewis, I think also Augustine, our hearts are restless until they rest in you.
Yes.
So there's a kind of argument for God's existence that starts with human consciousness. You can start with the external world. You can talk about the fine-tuning of the universe, or the universe has to have a cause because of philosophical and scientific considerations. But you can also look at your own awareness and analyze it and ask, what does my consciousness tell me about something outside of my consciousness? So the way I lay this out in the book is several steps. And the first one is we have an idea of God as an infinite being.
Mm-hmm.
Second, this idea in our minds needs explanation. Third, there are only 3 possibilities for explaining the existence of an idea in our mind. One, it comes from within our nature, that is, an innate idea. 2, it comes from without, or 3, it comes from our own devising. So Descartes goes on to say the idea of God cannot be explained by something outside of us, because nothing outside of us is infinite, and we couldn't make up the idea of infinity. So therefore, the innate idea of God, that's what it is, must be implanted in us by God himself, since God is the only credible source for doing so. Therefore, God exists. Now, this is an interesting way of arguing, because you're arguing not from the existence of the external world, how do we explain its design, its origin, but from the very idea of God itself. And the argument, the way I lay it out from Descartes, is valid, which means the premises logically lead to the conclusion. Nothing's laid out. So the only way you can really criticize this argument would be to dispute one of the premises.
Right.
I think it's a strong argument. It's not all that popular right now, and I didn't develop it as thoroughly as I might have, but I've always been taken by the argument, and I don't think it's something that should be dismissed, and I don't think Descartes should be dismissed, as he so often is, and viewed as the father of everything bad in the modern world.
Well, and again, as you and I have talked about before, there are very compelling arguments for the existence of God. And as people may want to read through some of your books, like on Christian apologetics, but those usually tend to be arguments from design, a teleological argument, or cause and effect, a cosmological argument, or even sometimes a moral argument. This is just another one that unfortunately isn't popular, because people think, well, there's just no way that this could be arguable and useful in a secular society. But given all the things that go on in our society today, why is it that everybody has this idea of God? And you know that the response I sometimes get from our so-called new atheist friends is, as well, if it weren't for all you people teaching religion or teaching about God, the default value would be atheism. But that just doesn't fit with all the history of the world, even what we have here now, because we have all sorts of tribes and other civilizations that were never in contact with anything that would be considered kind of a theistic view. And yet, as we go and explore those tribes, as we get to know more about some of the culture, the myths and other things, there's just this intuitive notion of God. And in some respects, if indeed you do have this idea of God, which seems to be just almost universal, then it does need an explanation. As you point out, there are only a few possibilities for that explanation. And if you work your way down the various syllogisms, you end up with this idea that the reason we believe there is a God is because God exists and has planted that idea in us. And that seems to correlate very well with what the scriptures say.
Well, it certainly does. Romans 1 tells us that God is known through his creation and also known through conscience. And as I've reflected on this over the years, there are just a riot of good arguments for God's existence. The one that you gave is the argument from original monotheism, that if you really look carefully at the religions and mythologies and various belief systems throughout the world, even in ancient, very ancient societies, you find some idea of a sky god, or a god that is beyond this world. And Winfried Corduan has developed that in several of his books. In fact, my second edition of Christian Apologetics will have an argument based on original monotheism. The idea for a lot of people is, the original religion was animism, and then people thought about it more and came up with the idea of infinity. And the concept of infinity for a being is not something you would derive from the empirical world. I think it's something that is built into us, and also God shows it to us in the external things. These things didn't come out of nothing. They have not always existed. So the best explanation is God as the cause and design of the universe, but you can even work from the very concept of God. And I don't talk about the ontological argument in this book, but there is another way of going from the idea of God as a perfect or maximal being to saying that this being must exist.
Let's see if we can, just for a moment, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but the issue of mind and matter, because something that Descartes helped us with is that these thoughts that we have, they don't necessarily come from matter. Of course, today we have all sorts of atheists saying, well, brain studies show that really you think you have a mind, but really the mind is just an artifact of the brain. But I love what you say. No one could say, I feel a neuron misfiring in my brain. The neuron may be misfiring, but that's not the point. And when people say, I'm angry, I'm confused. Yeah, we can do brain studies to show that somebody's elevated in terms of their brain activity, but we can't tell us why they're angry, why they're anxious, because those ideas are not physical. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it is. And I think this is a very strong argument by Descartes. He's more known for this argument, and that is that thinking and matter are two different categories, and they have different properties. So if you talk about being angry or being hopeful, that's not a property you would ascribe to a neuron or to anything physical. We use different language for our thoughts and our feelings than we do of matter. So the idea that he's telling us is that thought and matter are two different things. So thinking has to do, or consciousness has to do with thinking, and matter has to do with things that are extended, things that are out there in the world that can be measured in terms of height or weight or something like that. But even if you have a thorough representation of the brain with some kind of omni-scan, and you can see every physical thing that's going on in somebody's brain, you could never see the thought
right.
That I think, therefore I am. You couldn't see any thought. You couldn't see any emotion. Those are irreducibly subjective qualities that are not translatable into material terms. And if that's right, that means we have a soul. And if we have a soul, then that soul can exist apart from the body.
Yeah,
that's very profound in
right.
terms of how you view a human being.
And again, I think we've done a little better job of dealing with some of the misconceptions of Descartes. But if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more, it is chapter 5 in this book, and we've made it possible for you to contact Doug Groothuis. And again, I've encouraged you to think about getting him to come and speak as we maybe come out of some of these lockdowns. And certainly you can find out more about that, some of his blog post, and also this particular book. Next week, we'll talk about Blaise Pascal. Since you are kind of the expert on this, I think I've learned more about Pascal from you than any other person on this planet. I probably should give you an hour, but we'll try to do it in a half an hour if we can. And it's another chapter in this book called Philosophy in 7 Sentences. Dr. Doug Groothuis has been with us. And Doug, it is always great, and thank you for educating us about some of these philosophers that we, in some respects, can benefit from, but have never maybe studied because we've never been sitting in a philosophy class. So thank you for convening that today, and I look forward to next week.
Thanks. You're welcome. Thank you, Kerby.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, we have Kelly Shackelford, Penna Dexter, and we're going to spend some time working our way through lots of issues in the news. But if you've kind of enjoyed some of this philosophical discussion, I commend to you some of the links that we have provided. And if you would like to get a copy of the book, it's been around for a while, so it's very inexpensive, and it's a very helpful way for you to learn from some of these philosophers that are still influencing us from the grave. We'll take a break and be back right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition. As you might imagine, we have in studio with us now Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter. And, of course, we had Dr. Doug Groothuis on just a few minutes ago. And, again, appreciate some of the look at philosophy. But in this hour, we oftentimes have a disproportionate number of you that are in the state of Texas. So we tend to do a little bit of Texas stories, which even though we focus on Texas, those of you that are not in Texas listening right now, most of the stories actually
affect you as well. And Penna, one of those is that you were talking about the fact that there is a real attempt on the part of Texas to actually make sure that taxpayer funds never go to Planned Parenthood facilities through the Medicaid program. And that is something that is significant and is happening in Texas, but could happen in other states around the country as well.
Yes, in November, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overruled the lower courts because there's been this battle that's been going back and forth with Planned Parenthood affiliates in Texas. And the state wants, Texas conservatives and pro-lifers here want to eliminate their Medicaid taxpayer funding because, even if it doesn't go directly for an abortion, if it goes to Planned Parenthood, it supplements the action of abortion that takes place in those clinics. And so Ken Paxton now is that he's going to be at the Fifth Circuit fighting for that. And, so that's a good thing because you've got Joe Biden in the White House now just opening up the spigots to Planned Parenthood again, where Trump tried to limit that. So that's one good thing. And, this week, the Governor Abbott, made his State of the State address and talked about some of the things that he's hoping the legislature does, that he'll lead on. And it's, they're all very conservative. I think conservatives and Christians can be pleased by, at least initially, as the legislature is in its beginning weeks, some of the things that are going to be happening.
Yeah, I think a number of things are happening in Texas right now on the legislature. You got a new speaker of the House, and there was a lot of shakeup in the committee assignment. Still, a third of the committees are now going to be led by Democrats, which some more conservative Republicans are like, what? But that's just kind of how they've done things. But it's considered to be a shakeup that moved a little more to the conservative side. And then when it comes to the governor and his speech, one of the things he promised, there's going to be a constitutional amendment that's being offered that makes clear that the government may not shut down churches for any reason. Yes. That they have zero authority over telling a church that they cannot meet. Obviously, that would change things in the future when, different states, it's a great idea for any state, to be able to do. But that's one of the things. Another thing that was the top on his list was election reform and just making sure there's election integrity so everybody can be clear, because there were some shenanigans that were attempted in Texas, like pretty much every state, and they're trying to lock that down. The one thing that the Republican Party of Texas listed their top priorities, and the one thing that the governor did not list up there, which he said, the rumors was he was. So I would think he's publicly behind this, but there's a lot of lobbying going on because this is a bill that would say no taxpayer-funded lobbying, which I think most Americans kind of assume, but it's not true.
No.
What's happening all over the country, and Texas included, is they're taking, like your local government officials are taking your tax money and going to Austin to lobby for more state tax money. So it's something that conservatives are just highly against, but it's really, really, really hard to get it through because the lobbyists have so much power. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch in the Texas legislature.
I might just mention that we did have Representative Jeff Leach on earlier in the week. And if you go to our website right now and you could type in either Jeff Leach's name or you can type in churches as essential, you will see that we give you the information about that particular piece of legislation that he introduced in the House and was Kelly Hancock, I guess, in the Senate. And so we're encouraging, first of all, you to educate people about this. Number two, if it does pass, then you have to vote on it November of this year. So there are some great resources we've made available to you. And earlier in the week, I went through the list of some of the highest paid lobbyists in the state of Texas, provided by some of our friends at Empower Texas. And these people make millions and millions of dollars, and they're representing a lot of these
sometimes they're private entities, but some of the others are cities and counties and others, and our tax dollars are going to fund,
pay their fees,
fund these lobbyists, and that doesn't seem fair to me at all.
Yeah, it doesn't, and I don't think people realize that it's going on, but it's getting talked up now in some of the Texas publications, so that's good, and I'm glad that Jeff Leach and company are all on it. There's a few more things.
Sure.
Abbott also called for making Texas a Second Amendment sanctuary state, and they're going to definitely be protecting gun rights. And he calls for Texas to ban abortion altogether. It's more possible that might actually pass court muster with the changing court that continues to go well with Amy Coney Barrett added to the justices. And then there's another one. This is a quote, actually, that the law prevents any government entity from shutting down religious activities in Texas. So that's Abbott's quote. So that's good to hear. And then another one, they're pushing civics classes that teach children the values of freedom, good governance, and patriotism. And, I love that, except you have to make sure, whose civics is it? In Texas, we're probably pretty safe. But these are just some of the things that are going to be bantied about. And then there's we're going to discuss this issue later in the program, I think, but I think there's going to be a bill specifying that boys can only compete on boys' teams.
Very good. And that's another one. Let me just mention just kind of Texas politics and Texas Constitution 101. First 60 days, you can't actually deal with any legislation unless it's an emergency. And it was interesting that the governor put on his emergency issue. One of those was the whole issue of election reform. So that means they can deal with some of those issues. There were about 5 major ones. But, Kelly, just a lot of things happening right now. And Texas, in some respects, can be the model for other states. Because when we had Jeff Leach on, he was saying, okay, I recognize that some of your people are not in Texas, but if you want to write to me, we'll give you the model legislation. And if we can do it in Texas, maybe you can do it in your state as well.
It's happening all over the country right now. Election reform is a high priority issue. And the Constitution gives the states the right to come up with the modes and manners of their election for president. So it's not the federal government that really is supposed to control that. It's supposed to be the states. And so watching a bunch of the things, I mean, this happened in Texas, too. This just wasn't in Georgia and Pennsylvania and all these other places. Texas had some crazy stuff happen. If you remember down in Houston, they just decided on their own, despite the fact that there wasn't any state law allowing this, that they would just mail out millions of ballots. And the attorney general had to jump into court and stop that. And a number of other attempts like that were tried. And so they really do need to lock these things down and make real clear. I think the best example of turning this thing around is what Governor DeSantis did in Florida. You had Broward County, which was a joke, and all those elections where everybody was like, why can't they get things together? He made that a priority. And he basically said, look, if your election results aren't in by 9:30, you're fired. And they passed a bunch of reforms. What happened in Florida? Huge numbers of people voting. It was one of the first states. Everything was out. Everything was clear. There was no funny business. Everybody felt real confident with the election results. It can be done state by state. And so I think Texas can definitely improve their process as well.
I think the idea that you get it done, you get the votes counted very quickly that night, that's just extending it out for days is another recipe for cheating.
Yes.
So just getting it done, having your systems in place. And Florida, we have to remember back in 2000, they had problems. So the problems can spawn solutions if we allow that to happen.
Let me just mention, too, that one of the things we did earlier in the week is there was a very good piece from the Heritage Foundation. What they did was put together all the things that states should do, and then they had a list of all the things that states should not do as well.
Yeah, and Hans von Spassky, I think you can say his name better than I can. He's just the expert there. And, putting all of that on paper, that's almost like model legislation, or at least a call for the states for what they should do. And, I think that job number one for all the states that had mail-in balloting, make it just absentee balloting. Get rid of the mail-in.
Yeah, you've got to have security measures when you do. I mean, Texas, for instance, has absentee balloted, but that's when somebody says, I need a ballot because of this reason. here's my signature, here's my information. I mean, then you send it to that person. That's totally different from mailing millions of ballots into the middle of nowhere and then just seeing what'll happen or what'll come back.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a horrible way to do things, and again, hopefully that'll be cleaned up.
Yeah. HR1 says, well, we want to let people register online without signatures and same-day registration. What could possibly go wrong? We'll be right back.
During the early shutdowns back in April, author J.K. Rowling released a children's novel in 3 installments for families stuck at home. She actually wrote the Ichabod during the years when she was writing the Harry Potter series. The full novel was published in November. The story begins when King Fred of Cornucopia allows 2 manipulative and power-hungry advisors to convince him to embark on a quest to kill the Ichabod, a creature most of his subjects consider imaginary. While some citizens deem this a pointless but harmless mission, others discover that by amplifying the threat posed by this mythical creature, they can rally the citizenry to achieve certain nefarious goals. They enact an Ichabod tax to defend against this terror and another tax to pay the tax collectors. These taxes harm smaller shopkeepers and poor cornucopians. The wealthy find ways to escape the damage. The clampdowns eventually tank Cornucopia's economy. Citizens who complain about the drastic measures taken to battle a creature whose existence they doubt are accused of treason by the king's ambitious advisors. Dissenters are imprisoned. The 2 heroes of the story, children named Daisy and Bert, are taken from their parents and placed in an orphanage where they are denied outside communication. J.K. Rowling made clear that the idea for this story came to her well over a decade ago, but it's uncanny how accurately it portrays the financial damage done by government-dictated lockdowns in response to COVID-19 to small businesses and their owners and employees. And Daisy and Bert's confinement to an orphanage speaks to the enormous educational and emotional toll the response to the pandemic has taken on children, even though they are the least likely to suffer from the virus. An article by Sarah Rinder in First Things highlights additional striking COVID-19 parallels in the Ichabod. J.K. Rowling herself says, it's a story about truth and the abuse of power. She certainly picked the right moment to release it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention that while we were talking about this idea of Planned Parenthood, one of the things that the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton cited were the undercover videos showing Planned Parenthood. And I thought I might just use that to mention that our take action item right now is for you to, if you have not received it, get my media bias booklet. And instead of sending it out, it's just a perfect download to you. But in the latter part of that booklet, I spent some time talking about, okay, if there's media bias, what are the impacts? And one of those, of course, that we've talked about is that when they did surveys of individuals in these 7 major swing states of those people that voted for Joe Biden, when they educated them about 8 different issues, most of them said, oh, I didn't know about that. And 17% of them said, I would have voted differently if I'd known about those. And that would, of course, then given Donald Trump 311 electoral votes. But the other story I used was about how very few people know about the existence of these undercover videos. And as a result, just an illustration again of why people don't have maybe a more accurate understanding of, say, who Planned Parenthood is,
fetal tissue sales and those kinds of things. So it is, I think, striking that Ken Paxton used the example of the undercover video of Planned Parenthood's fetal tissue activities to make the case for why Planned Parenthood needs to be defunded.
Yes, David DeLayden did those. I forget the name of the organization, but he's still fighting legal battles because of that. And a lot of that was actually launched by our current vice president, Kamala Harris, when she was Attorney General in California. And we in the Christian world, we get emails from pro-life groups, so we knew about this. But it is amazing because it should be front page news, or at least often reported in the main newspapers and on television, but it's not. That kind of a thing where body parts from babies, the abortion is actually being altered and done in a different way so the body part can be sold, and that Planned Parenthood executives admitted this. And there's been a lot of videoing undercover done by people like that, people like Lila Rose at Live Action, people like James O'Keefe at Veritas. And, it goes around the internet and conservatives will get it. But it's just amazing how the left really controlled media stays away from that stuff. It would sell, it would get you to watch your show if you teased that, but they have an agenda and they don't want the public to know those things.
It's also interesting, we're talking, this is sort of more Texas listeners in this hour than other hours, and then the national hour coming up. But this is not just a Texas story, because look at what happens, okay? You've got, any state can do this. Texas is saying, we don't want to participate in your federal program if it means we're going to send money to Planned Parenthood. You can do that if you want to. But here's the funny thing is, you would think you could do that, but they had a federal judge say, no, you have to send your money to Planned Parenthood. You're like, wait a second, I thought we elected these people and they could decide that we don't want to send our money there. No, you have no choice. And so why is Texas now having the freedom to do this? It really goes back to the federal judges that the Trump administration appointed, because it went up to the Fifth Circuit, the Federal Court of Appeals, and they've got real judges now who actually do their job and don't act like politicians. And they said, well, Texas can do what they want to do. They're the state legislature. They can decide if they want to send money or not send money. And so all this really comes back to getting good judges in place so that we do have freedom, and that people who do have freedom, and that it's not controlled by, bureaucrats or judges in a back room, which is not how our country's supposed to work. So thank goodness. But it's also an example to other states and what they can do.
And Penny, we were talking about Kelly last week when he wasn't here, because we said that there was a judge that Ken Paxton went to actually prevent the moratorium on deportations. Mm-hmm. And we said, I think Kelly knows who that judge is. So that was a good example of that, right?
A wonderful Christian guy. He's the kind of guy that Point of View listeners would love. And you don't have to worry about him thinking, hey, I'm a judge, I'm just going to do what I want to do. I think that this is morally right, so I don't really care what the law is. I'm going to do what I think should be morally right. No, these are people that there's a humility that's needed to be a good judge. And really you have to be able to resist power. Because when you have the power to do things, it's tempting to do what you think is right. But what you have to do if you're a good judge is go, no, it's not about me. It's about, what does the law say? What did the people pass? I'm going to make myself subservient to the law. And that's what the whole rule of law is about. It's not the rule of men. It's the rule of law. And so, when you've got guys like this judge in South Texas, mm-hmm. You're going to get a good decision, which he says, look, the Biden administration might want to do this. People might think this is a great idea. You just don't have the power to do this, because what you're doing is directly against what the law says. And that's exactly what we need. And, Drew is an example of one of 234 judges appointed during the Trump administration that really have that originalist approach. What is the original meaning of the text? Not what do I want it to be, not, we're evolving, so I'll shift it or change it a little bit. And the best way I've described this to Christians who don't necessarily understand all the legal stuff is I said, if you believe in an evolutionary document approach to the Constitution or the law, that's kind of like the pastor that believes in an evolutionary approach to the Bible. If you've got to make it current by changing the meanings and having new interpretations that change things, they know what that is. And that's exactly what these judges had been doing. But we have really shifted that around now. We've got a Supreme Court with 6 members now who say their job is to look at the original meaning and find the original meaning, not make it current, not go with what we think, not go with where society is going, but now to go with the document. And so if we want to change things, if we don't like the law, it's going to be up to us, which is how it's supposed to be.
I read a very interesting article today in the newsletter that First Liberty puts out. It was by Hiram Sasser.
Oh, yes.
And he was talking about packing the courts and how FDR tried to do that. And, the language they used, even back then, he said that he wanted, this is a quote from President Roosevelt, he seeks to restore the court. The court packing plan seeks to restore the court and to have it resume its high task of building anew on the Constitution a system of living law. The living Constitution. It means, it's updated and modernized all the time. And the meaning of the actual words change. And, he was stopped by an actual principled Democrat because they held the House and the Senate and the White House back then. And it's the same situation we're facing now. But I just thought, wow, these things just don't go away. And the court could be used for nefarious. And actually, the court could be used to make sure that the right and the Republicans never get power again. And that's why I hope that there are some principled Democrats that will help us to maintain our constitutional republic.
Yeah, it's a great story because, that story, and the Democrats had the House 4-1 and had the Senate by a huge majority. They could not pass it because the American people knew it was a horrible idea to pack the court. And in fact, the Senate sponsor died of a heart attack before it was over. So, it really hurt FDR's PR rating. So, maybe one of the reasons why the Biden administration is not pushing it really hard.
Yes. If nothing else, those are resources from First Liberty, and I subscribe to it, and I encourage you to do the same because it's a great organization, and we'll come back and talk about an impeachment trial right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the weekend edition, and we are so privileged to have Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford with us today in studio. And as you might imagine, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about the impeachment trial, which I've called kind of a so-called impeachment trial, because I'm looking at my Constitution here, and if it's a real impeachment trial, you have to have due process, you have to have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But anyway, we'll get into that and get some thoughts about that. Have some other questions about election reform. We have some questions about whether or not we're ever going to send some of these kids back to school, which is a big issue that we've talked about as well, and a variety of other topics that we will try to address as we go through this. And I'll come to you, Penna, for just a minute. But again, this piece that came out from John Yoo, who's been on the program with us before, an eminent constitutional scholar, said, you know, if nothing else, he's thinking that the Senate rashly claimed jurisdiction over a former president. That doesn't make any sense. And he said, if anything, as the Senate launches its second impeachment trial, its members must confront some deep unfairness of the proceedings. Your thoughts?
Well, it was unfair in one sense. I mean, even if you buy the argument that it's okay to impeach somebody after they're out of office, and I think that people that know the Constitution are on both sides of that matter. You don't have everyone saying it's unconstitutional, True. But you do have, well, we can talk about Rand Paul later, but I thought he was very strategic and smart in getting a vote on a resolution to say that it's unconstitutional. He didn't pass that vote, but he got 45 Republicans to say that it was unconstitutional, and that, I think, was huge for PR. So in the House, there wasn't evidence presented. There wasn't really any kind of a case made. It was just, we have to do this. And so now the Senate, I think, will have to, and Kelly could talk about this more, I'm sure they're going to have some witnesses called and things like that if they're going to do this. I still wish they just wouldn't do it. I think it's a big distraction, although it actually could end up, because both sides will be able to call witnesses, it could be maybe good for Trump, because the argument will be made about, again, there'll be evidence presented about the unfairness and the shenanigans that went on in various states with the elections and why he couldn't concede right away. And so I don't know, how that's going to play out and what the media will do with it. But Liz Cheney, who's the third most powerful congresswoman, and she heads the House Republican Conference, and she voted for impeachment. And, of course, there was a lot of call and hue and cry for her to be removed from that position because of her support of impeachment. And she wasn't removed. There was even a vote, and she wasn't. She's retained. And in a sense, I think that's good, because the House needs to be, we have all kinds of people in the House of Representatives. We have all kinds of support of Trump. You either support him, you don't, you're somewhere in between. And so, you don't need to be jettisoning whole sections of the Republican Party, I think, if you're going to be a party of the future. But the party is going to have to figure out how to move forward. And maybe impeachment will unify the party. I don't know.
Gosh, where do you start? I mean, this is it's a mockery. This whole thing is a mockery for anybody who cares about the Constitution. But unfortunately, what's happened with the country as a whole, I don't think this would be true of most point of view listeners, is the ends just justifies the means. If I don't like somebody, then it doesn't matter what process I put into place. Which really, it's an attack upon the whole concept of the rule of law, which is just crucial in this country. And people, again, everybody kind of takes it for granted, but it's what makes America America, and it's really dangerous. And so, why did I say that? I mean, let's start with the fact that this is an impeachment. It's like a criminal trial. You have to start with due process. What happened in the House was not due process. We've never seen anything like that before. And again, the best way to do this is apply this to yourself. Let's say the government is coming after you, and let's say they say, "Oh no, we're not going to give you any chance to even say anything at the hearing or offer any evidence or disagree with anything. We're just going to go ahead and have a vote and just get this going. We don't even need you." And you have zero due process rights to see anything, say anything, do anything. That's never happened in the history of our country. They were just in a hurry. And then okay, that'd be okay with you if they were criminally prosecuting your children, maybe. The government's in a hurry. They really don't have time for your due process. So it's bad right off the get-go. Then you get into the fact that what they're doing now is totally unconstitutional. Number one, impeachment is for, and this, look in the Constitution, read it, the president, the vice president, and civil officers. Okay? Well, Trump is not the president, he's not the vice president, and he's not a civil officer. Okay, well, that's a problem. And then it says, why do you have it? To remove them from office. He's not in office. Okay, so you can't remove him from office, unless you mean his office in Mar-a-Lago, or maybe from the golf course. It's just silly. And then it gets even worse. You go over and you look at in the other article, which it talks about, it was talking about Congress, and it talks about impeachment, and it specifically says if you are impeaching the president of the United States, or actually the specific words is a presidential impeachment, that's what it's saying, then the Chief Justice must preside. Well, the Chief Justice is not going to be there. Why is he not going to be there? Because it's unconstitutional. So on so many levels. So Pat Leahy, we've got a Democratic senator who's going to pretend to be the Chief Justice. This whole thing is just like, I don't know, it's loony. And then we haven't even gotten to the actual, article of impeachment itself, which is just completely ludicrous. So, if they want to censor Trump, they could censure Trump and say bad things and make it in the record and do it. This is not a constitutional impeachment. It's really kind of a show trial. It's kind of let's see if we can say bad things about the president, and it really is just an embarrassment as far as the country goes from a point of the rule of law. So
I think that it will, there's no way that they can really do it. They have so many. They can't convict him because it takes too many votes to do it. So I do agree that it's for show in some sense, and it's to allow everybody to say what they want to say about him. And but I guess maybe after the break we can talk about, do you think it was smart of Trump to decline to appear on his own behalf or not? Or why didn't he? And what would be the reason to do that or not to do that? I think it would be something to talk about.
Those are some very important issues. And by the way, if you'd like to join us, we're going to move on to other topics. But again, this is the opportunity to hear from two individuals that will be kind of helping us look ahead to what will happen next week. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Talk about what might happen, what could have happened, and we'll talk about all of that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Representative Dan Crenshaw started his commentary about lockdowns, but quickly focused on how our brains process risk. He wanted to help us understand why Americans see the pandemic and the lockdowns very differently. He cites research that discovered that Democrats and Republicans differ in their neural mechanism activated during risk-taking exercises, specifically in the amygdala region. This demonstrates measurable physiological differences when confronted with risk. For example, conservatives overwhelmingly fill the ranks of physically riskier jobs such as the military, law enforcement, and loggers. What does this mean in terms of the pandemic that we faced this last year? Well, conservatives are less risk-averse to physical threats and less likely to favor more extreme actions to mitigate risk. Liberals, he argues, are more likely to believe that government can solve problems and are willing to accept such measures. He also quotes from research by Dr. Jonathan Haidt, who's been on my radio program to talk about his latest book. He found that liberals overemphasize caring and fairness above other moral considerations. Conservatives favor these moral categories, but also value moral authority and tradition, liberty, and loyalty. And this also explains why liberals routinely denigrate contextualized COVID-19 data, such as accounting for age and comorbidities when assessing fatalities, because they see this as downplaying the virus. If we're to have a civil debate about the responses to the pandemic, then we need to understand the differences between us and frame the discussion accordingly. Representative Crenshaw wisely reminds us that some of the differences we have about government policy are affected by how our brains process risk and emotions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
What's going to be like to join our conversation? That number is 1-800-351-1212. It is, of course, our weekend edition. We'll talk a little bit longer about the impeachment trial. And you raised a very good question, Penna Dexter. Kelly Shackelford here as well. And that is, I wondered when they actually suggested that the former president, I want to underscore former president, Donald Trump, could have testified. Would that have been interesting? Well, I think everybody would have been watching the impeachment trial then. But again, was that a good idea or bad idea? What's your thoughts?
I think knowing how Donald Trump tends to be slightly undisciplined when he speaks, and it wouldn't have been a teleprompter, speech or, a planned speech. I think it probably was smart not to, because especially if they have others that can actually speak to the evidence of misbehavior, of not checking, of changing election laws in various states and not abiding by their own state's election laws, and all those reasons that Trump did not concede, and that the battle kept on going for weeks and weeks. But if Donald Trump were speaking, it probably would have been a little bit maybe more like the speech that he gave that day on January 6th. And you don't want that. We don't need any more. I mean, everybody kind of knows those arguments. So I think maybe getting lawyers and expert testimony, maybe some people that worked in the polls or whatever. I don't know what kind of people they're going to call. Might be more effective.
Yeah, I think if you look at it like a normal legal situation, I think it was very wise. It's kind of like if somebody's let's say you were being charged with some crime that you didn't commit, and you already knew that over half of the jury believed you were innocent and wasn't going to vote to convict you, you would never go on the stand.
That's right.
Right? And so in this case, you've already got a vote. You have to have 2/3 in the Senate. You've already got 47, what was the number
45.
again? 45 people who said this whole process is unconstitutional. So why would you mess that up? The other thing I think is, we just talked about what a farce it's just a show trial. It's like something that you would do in the Soviet Union. This is not the United States to violate the Constitution, but realize what I think it was Raskin or what they said in their, I think this was in their brief, where they said the First Amendment doesn't apply to the president. They're like, oh, I'm sorry, I thought we were actually going by the Constitution, which is where impeachment is. And so these people have no intention of following any rules or law or anything. So I would never allow my client in that kind of a circus situation. It's really, really odd. I'll be very surprised if there are any witnesses called.
Right.
Really?
I will. They'll have to work out whatever they're going to do on that. But again, if you're Trump, you don't need to call anything. You just start off and go, "Oh, case over." But I know Trump will want to. He'll want his attorneys to put some things out, and they will. But if you'll remember how it was done last time, there were no witnesses.
That's right.
But then the lawyers made the arguments and brought the different evidence forward of what was out there. And in this case, they're going to point out, number one, that this is totally unconstitutional, that this violates the very words of the Constitution. And then when they go into the act, and they'll talk about the fact there was no due process. Again, they don't need Trump on either one of those things. And then third, if you go into the actual article of impeachment, it's just baseless because what it says is he incited an insurrection. Well, there are definitions for what an incitement means.
Yes.
Basically, the president would have to have said, he could even speak to violence, and it's still not an insurrection.
Because you got Supreme Court precedents.
Yes, he would have to.
Very high bar.
He would have to say, I want you to commit violence right now. Go now and do this. Not only did he not say that, he specifically told them, those who were there, that I want you to patriotically and peacefully let your voices be heard. Then add to that the FBI information that's sort of leaking out right now is that the people who did this were planning this before, they had the pipe bombs laid out the night before and all this stuff. So this has nothing to do with Trump. It's like baseless on baseless on baseless. So the question you ask yourself is, what are the Democrats doing? Some of which is that just the hatred for Trump is so great that they just can't even see. But at this point, they know they're not going to win. So the only purpose I imagine in what they're going to try to do is see how much they can smear or say bad things about the president, which I'm like, can't you get past that and just move on? But evidently they can. I think they're really hurting Biden and the presidency because this would be a chance for him to kind of have that first 100 days and really get some momentum and get support. And this is just going to divide. It's going to take focus off of any agenda items he has. And I think it's going to, it's not going to be helpful that I can see in any way. So I don't totally get what's going on here. It just seems like, and look, this is not a Democrat thing. Democrats and Republicans who hate Trump hate him so much that they just seem to lose all balance. They just are so angry that they do things that aren't necessarily very smart or very, or very reasoned, in my opinion. And so this just looks silly to me, and it's embarrassing and it's harmful because impeachment it's kind of like the death penalty in politics, and they're treating it like, bubble gum, or I don't know. They're treating it like it's just nothing, and throwing out due process and violating the Constitution and bringing articles of impeachment that are clearly not, don't meet the requirements. But they're doing it anyway. So, we'll sit and watch and see what happens, I guess.
So if the Trump lawyers are making all the arguments that you mentioned, and then one other might be that it's not unusual to challenge electoral votes. It's been done before.
Absolutely.
The Democrats have used that often, and you don't necessarily it's not immoral for you to look at what the process was and challenge some of it. And so that's another argument. There are really 4 laid out, I think, by the Daily Signal, the Heritage Foundation, and you mentioned all the rest, like incitement is not, you can't define it the way they're defining it, for one thing.
Let's take a phone call just to get your comments, and we'll go to North Carolina. Nancy, thank you for joining us. What's your thoughts?
You're welcome. My thoughts are that no matter what Trump does, he's going to get slammed from either side. I think that if he tries to answer any of their comments, they're just going to slash him right to pieces. So I just think he should just avoid it. Let the law take whatever place it's going to take regarding this. And I think it's going to wind up with the Democrats having egg all over their faces once again.
Yeah.
I just think that I think it's a travesty.
He may just go out and play golf that day.
I imagine he will. Yeah,
You can't tweet about it.
That's a good thing.
I would expect it. I mean, that's the kind of way I look at this. They're trying, again, impeachment is to remove somebody from office, and they're going to try to impeach Trump to remove him from the golf course in Mar-a-Lago. I mean, it's just silly. I do think that the person who's already lost, in my opinion, is President Biden, because I think this was an opportunity for him. If he really meant what he was saying in his inauguration about unity, which I think he's now clearly shown he doesn't mean. It's the old politician deal of saying one thing and then going back and signing, 30 executive orders, setting a record that are very divisive. This was a real opportunity for him. It wouldn't have cost him really anything. All you have to do is come out and say, this is not helpful for the country. Let's unite. Let's get behind my good proposals, move forward. He would have gotten, every president gets a little bit of grace, I'll give him a shot, and that's kind of how you start. But he just threw that all away. And I don't think it's necessary. I mean, it's one of two things. It's either because Biden is like a lot of these other people and just hates Trump so much that he can't control himself. Or, and I think this one is more likely, his extremist base wants this so bad that he can't afford to not give it to him.
Yeah.
And again, you're never going to have unity if that's how you're operating the presidency.
Well, some people are under the delusion that he could actually get convicted in the Senate, and if that happened, they could go on then by a majority vote and actually vote to not allow him to run again. So I think that base, that's kind of part of their plan, although the realists in the party can see that he will never be convicted.
We're going to take a break and move on to some other issues. First of all, one of our articles about how Republicans in the Senate are trying to force a couple of votes, and one of those is whether or not to withhold taxpayer dollars from shut down schools. We'll talk about that right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Kelly Shackelford, Penna Dexter in our weekend edition. And one of our articles, I call it Votorama, that's what they called it, and that's Senate Republicans forcing votes on a number of issues. And one of those is something I wanted to hear Penna talk about in just a minute, and that is they actually tried to have an amendment to hold back taxpayer dollars from schools that are shut down. After all, if you're not even in school, why should you be getting this kind of federal funds? But while we're talking about schools, Penna, I thought it would be good just to talk about another one of these victories from First Liberty in terms of the schools, because if nothing else, one of the reasons we like to feature this is not only to celebrate the victories, but to educate some of our listeners that if something like this has happened to your student, your child, or your grandchild, you can always contact First Liberty. So we've got another success, don't we?
Yes, we do, in the state of Illinois. And, sometimes these cases, you just kind of have to empathize with the parent whose child is stuck in this situation. But this one sounds like it's a victory.
Absolutely. Yeah. You have somebody where they tried they were forcing all the kids into a gender and diversity, reprogramming class.
Yep.
And, you had a family here and a student who said, I object to this, of what you're trying to force down my throat. And in Illinois, we have there is a law there that protects people for religious accommodation, that you can't force people into classes that violate their beliefs and their faith. But the school decided, well, we don't want to follow that law, so we're going to force you anyway, and we're gonna beat up on this student, which is totally inappropriate. So fortunately, we were contacted and we were able to reach out, and we said not only in our letter to the school district, but also to the press that, look, they can either follow the law voluntarily or they can follow the law, when a federal judge or a state judge or whoever tells them to follow the law, but they will be following the law. And fortunately, I think for everybody, 2 days later, they announced that they were protecting this young lady, and they're not going to force them to violate their faith. And so, it's a victory. But these are the kind of things that people are going to have to fight for more, because this whole cancel culture, this whole force you into believing like everybody. I mean, again, it's like a scene from 1984, right, from the book. We're like reprogramming camps, and this is what they want to force everybody into. And we're going to have to stand our ground. There are rights in this country. You have a right to be able to follow your own faith, your own freedom of conscience, your own freedom of speech, and they can't violate that. And when they do, they have to be called to account.
So this girl, her name is Marcielle McBride, and she's at the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy. That's where she is. But you'd think that was pretty cut and dried. But they want her to complete the student gender and sexuality program there. And we all know that they're going to redefine sex to mean whatever you wake up thinking you are that day, really redefining reality. And, I think the question I have here, Kelly, is so on your arguments were made on religious liberty grounds. But what about there are lots of Americans who aren't even necessarily people of faith, but they are people of science or common sense. Do they have protection against their child being forced to do a program like this?
Yeah, in a lot of places they do. It just depends upon where they are. For instance, in Texas, it specifically says moral or religious objections. So, this would be a moral objection. They're asking my child to say something that is a lie, that's false. There are two sexes, male and female. And there are other things that in the process that might violate it. But it does depend upon the law of the state. Now, there's also the federal law of the Constitution. And there are cases which go back to the 1920s that say that parents have a fundamental right to direct the upbringing and education of their children.
There you go.
And therefore, if the school is trying to teach something that violates those, and people before have tried to go in and change the curriculum. Okay, you can't win that. You're not going to win that case. You can't say, because I believe a certain way, I want to change the curriculum for everybody else. But you should be able to have the protection of your children. Because otherwise what that would mean is the government can force your kids into things and basically browbeat them in any direction they want, and there's no freedom of conscience for the children or for their family. So you have federal constitutional rights, but then a lot of times in the states, again, this is Illinois, right? Not exactly a conservative state, but you had protections there for religious accommodation, and in this case, this young lady got that protection. But I love that, you knew that this was difficult for her family to stand up, but thank goodness they did. Again, we talked about this before, but this reminds me a little bit of Live Not by Lies. And what it talks about in these countries where totalitarianism is coming in, this is the type of thing they do. You force you into a reprogramming camp, right? And what it takes, it doesn't take a majority. It just takes enough people who know the truth and are willing to stand for the truth, even though they will suffer for doing so. You know that this young lady and her family will now be persecuted. There's no doubt.
Right.
But they did what was right. And if enough people say the emperor has no clothes, like, guess what? There are two sexes, then eventually the other people will go, why am I going along with this foolishness? And the whole thing collapses. And so to me, this is an example of courage, of willingness to stand for the truth, and to teach your children to stand for the truth.
Let me just mention that on Monday, we actually put the piece by Ryan Anderson, who's the new head of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. It says religious liberty isn't enough. He wasn't against religious liberty, but he was basically saying the same thing that Rod Dreher is saying, Live Not by Lies, and that is sometimes we just need to stand up in the midst of a culture that says 2 + 2 = 5 and say, no, 2 + 2 = 4. There's a boy, there's a girl, and whether the executive order from the President of the United States or even a particular school board says, no, it's not, you need to stand up and speak the truth.
You may have already talked about this because it happened earlier in the week, but I thought Rand Paul did a very good job of doing that this week because he went up in the hearing for the new Secretary of Education appointed by Joe Biden. And his name is Miguel Cardona. He used to be the Commissioner of Education for the state of Connecticut, and that's the state where it's sort of ground zero for the transgenders posing as girls to be on the track teams. Yes. So this Commissioner of Education that's allowed that to happen there is now up to be Secretary of Education for the whole country. So I think Rand Paul thought that was a little bit important, and he sought to ask a question about it, and it was pretty good because, he was saying how bizarre that is to even think that boys could be on girls' teams. And where are the feminists on this? And what planet are you from? He's asking the nominee this question. He was very strong, but nothing that he said was outlandish or beyond the truth. And what they are trying to do to our kids across the country and to completely strip athletic opportunities from girls. Yes. If it becomes a national policy, which it will under the Secretary of Education.
It'll be the end of girls' sports.
It'll be the end of girls' sports.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I love that Rand Paul had experience. He said, I have athletes in my family who are like college female athletes. And he said the idea that, my 5'4" niece is supposed to compete with some 6'2" muscled guy and that's supposed to be fair. And that's what he said. What planet are you on? And I think like 90% of America is there shaking their head up and down. And yet the guy could not say that it's back to the Live Not by Lies. Could not say the truth.
Could not.
It's so obvious what the truth is, but he couldn't say it. And this is how totalitarianism works. Everybody's forced to go along with the lie, but you're really not. You can speak the truth.
Let me mention again, if you find yourself saying, well, I would like to read this for myself, because it actually has the point, counterpoint, and what everybody said. It's the 5th article we've posted on the website here. Rand Paul to Education Secretary nominee who says boys have a right to compete in girls' sports. What planet are you from? And Penna, as you pointed out, it not only has the comments, but it gives you the back and forth. And It is just, again...
This one's fascinating reading. It's from cnsnews.com. I would email this article to everyone you know, because this is really happening in the halls of our government, and people need to understand it.
And another thing, I know, Kerby, if they go to pointofview.net, there's a link for First Liberty, or they can just go to firstlibertylive.com. This next week, we're going to have a First Liberty Live on court packing, where we're going to talk through kind of what has gone on in history, what's going on now, so people can understand it, because it's talked about a lot, but not everybody knows the history of what's been tried before, of why this is so dangerous. And again, firstlibertylive.com, or they can just go to pointofview.net.
Again, I would encourage you to watch that. We'll be promoting it next week, but we need to take a break, and we'll be back with more right after this.
During the early shutdowns back in April, author J.K. Rowling released a children's novel in 3 installments for families stuck at home. She actually wrote the Ichabod during the years when she was writing the Harry Potter series. The full novel was published in November. The story begins when King Fred of Cornucopia allows 2 manipulative and power-hungry advisors to convince him to embark on a quest to kill the Ichabod, a creature most of his subjects consider imaginary. While some citizens deem this a pointless but harmless mission, others discover that by amplifying the threat posed by this mythical creature, they can rally the citizenry to achieve certain nefarious goals. They enact an Ichabod tax to defend against this terror, and another tax to pay the tax collectors. These taxes harm smaller shopkeepers and poor cornucopians. The wealthy find ways to escape the damage. The clampdowns eventually tank Cornucopia's economy. Citizens who complain about the drastic measures taken to battle a creature whose existence they doubt are accused of treason by the king's ambitious advisors. Dissenters are imprisoned. The 2 heroes of the story, children named Daisy and Bert, are taken from their parents and placed in an orphanage where they are denied outside communication. J.K. Rowling made clear that the idea for this story came to her well over a decade ago, but it's uncanny how accurately it portrays the financial damage done by government-dictated lockdowns in response to COVID-19 to small businesses and their owners and employees. And Daisy and Bert's confinement to an orphanage speaks to the enormous educational and emotional toll the response to the pandemic has taken on children, even though they are the least likely to suffer from the virus. An article by Sarah Rinder in First Things highlights additional striking COVID-19 parallels in the Ichabod. J.K. Rowling herself says, it's a story about truth and the abuse of power. She certainly picked the right moment to release it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Have a couple phone calls. Let me take this one first before we get into some of the other articles that we've posted on the website. And Brian, listening on KBDT, I think you have a question for Kelly Shackelford, so thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on. Number one, thanks for this program. I think it's a huge blessing, and I pray often that the Lord continues to bless everybody that's involved with this. Just listening to the conversation about the forced education on our kids, I work for a large multinational corporation with a big presence in Texas, and we were all just informed last night that we were going to have mandatory unconscious bias training, which I am fully against. Yeah. Do I have any rights to defend myself as a person who works for a company in an at-will state.
Yeah, it's, I mean, that's a tough issue that's out there for everybody that's working for these companies. One of the things we talked about that book, Live Not by Lies, one of the chapters that has is on woke capitalism and how it's being used as sort of, it used to be the government that was the totalitarian. Now it's the corporations that it's sort of been forced on everybody. The answer is we have a pamphlet. If you go to firstliberty.org that you can get, it's on your rights in the workplace, and it will tell you what your rights are. Every situation is a little different, though. So I would just say if after you look at those things you're not clear, just call, because you kind of need to. Typically, people need to know. They'll ask you a little more to get into the factuals of what that actually means, what the program actually says, if you know what it says or what it requires you to do, and then they can give you your options on that, on what you can choose to do after you know what your rights are.
Okay. All right. Well, Lord bless you all, and I thank you for the program, and thank you for the time.
No, thank you.
I might even mention those booklets because they're so well done, and your rights in the workplace, because that is significant, and I think we're going to face more and more of that, Kelly. And this idea of unconscious bias, we did some commentaries on that back when it was being promoted by, at that time, Starbucks. And it's the whole question is really, if you will, not exactly factually based, and just, again, one of those issues that I think needs to be reevaluated by people that have at least a little bit of common sense in the HR departments of some of these major multinational corporations.
One of the things I would highly suggest for anybody is if you are going to express some objection to that information. I mean, first, know your rights and all, and all that. But one of the key things that provide you more protection is make sure you mention that these things you believe flow from your faith, your religious beliefs. Because if somebody comes in and says, I'm just philosophically against what you're doing, there's no philosophical protection in the law.
Very
there
true.
is a religious freedom protection in the law. Under federal law, employers are not allowed to discriminate against people based on their religion. Well, that's kind of obvious. I think most people know that. But there's an additional requirement under federal law, which is that employers have to affirmatively accommodate the religious beliefs of their employees if they can do so without causing an undue hardship to their business. So, they do have to accommodate. So there's all these cases about people who maybe they're Seventh-day Adventists or they're Orthodox Jews and they can't work on the Sabbath, on Friday night, sundown to Saturday night. Well, if they can schedule around that, they're required to. So I just say that because if somebody is expressing an objection and they never communicate to the company that their objection is a religious objection, then they don't get that protection. But because the company is not on any notice that there's any religious issue. So people need to, if they're going to express an objection, check out your legal rights first, but then also make sure that your faith is a part of the process, because that is protected by law.
This kind of unconscious bias training, where you're reaching down and you're finding your racism and your white supremacy inside and apologizing and being forced to do so. It was going on in the federal government also, across the government. Mm-hmm. And then there wasn't it was brought to light by Christopher Rufo, who was at the Discovery Institute. I don't know if you had him on, but it was a great thing that he did, because then President Trump got wind of that and he banned all that kind of training across the federal government. It was required. Well, guess what?
It's all back.
It's all back. I mean, I think it may have been the first or second day of Biden's presidency was one of his executive orders to reverse that. So it's just another piece of evidence with regard to, they're not going to allow any or as very few of the Trump accomplishments to stand. And that's unfortunate. And American, especially believers, but just thinking Americans need to be aware of this. Otherwise, over the years, we just get complacent, and they actually do train our minds. And we don't want that to happen.
You know, I might just say for a minute, buyer beware, because right about now you're starting to think about where your children or grandchildren might be going to college in the fall.
Yeah.
And there is a new watchdog site that was started by this Cornell University professor, and he was on with Tucker Carlson the other night, and it is called the Critical Race Theory Watchdog Site, and they've actually identified all these different universities where you're getting a heavy dose of critical race theory. And that's something else that Rod Dreyer talks about in his book, Live Not by Lies. And now they're saying, okay, well, I appreciate the fact that you've now covered all these universities about this, but now can you go back? This is going to take a lot of time. And identify everything from K through 12 where it's being taught in these schools.
That's hard.
And that's going to be a lot tougher. But if nothing else, Kelly, it's just where we need to recognize that a fair amount of this is not coming from the federal government, although we just pointed out what, of course, the incoming president, Joe Biden, has done. Some of this is just coming from these corporations, and we need to be paying attention to that in terms of where you're going to go to work, where you're going to send your kids to school.
What products you're going to buy sometimes, too.
Yeah. Well, and we're seeing some real impacts with that, with the products, right? With what's been going on, this whole cancel culture. You know, and again, I mean, we not that we're going into this in depth now. You've gone into critical race theory numerous times, but the big problem with this whole approach of what they're trying to do is they're engaging in racism to talk about racism. You know, it's all this thing is they look at you based upon what your race is versus the fact that everybody is a child of God, creating the image of God and an equal value. And so any Christian who understands, who's thinking, who has a biblical worldview, understands that the teaching in these goes directly against their faith, goes directly against God's purpose and how he sees things. And it's racist. Again, they're trying to address racism by engaging in racism, and that's not how you do it.
Again, for those of you who might say, well, I need to know a little bit more about critical race theory, we've posted what I think is really one of the best analysis of critical race theory from Doug Groothuis, because he's looking at just from a logical point of view and also kind of from an apologetics point of view, because actually no evidence is being allowed to contradict the idea, because we have such a racist society that any evidence you give that's contrary, well, just shows you're racist in the first place. So first of all, 3 cheers for his article, which is on our website. And 3 cheers maybe for William Jacobson, a Cornell law professor who has actually put together this watchdog site so that if nothing else, you can kind of see where your kids might go. You're safe if you send them to Hillsdale or Grove City or some things like that, but you might want to check out that as well. We need to take a break, though. And when we come back, I still want to talk about an issue that Penna has written about, and that is, isn't it time to send the kids back to school? And yet there are a number of various locales where that is not taking place. And they had a vote in the Senate saying, well, then if you're not going to have schools, maybe we shouldn't send federal dollars to those schools. So we'll talk about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, it is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford, and this hour I want to first of all talk about some of the votes taking place in the Senate. Senate Republicans have said, okay, we want you to give us an up or down vote on a few things. Should we include checks for illegal immigrants? Should we raise taxes on small business? And even had an amendment to hold back taxpayer dollars from schools that were shut down. So we'll talk about that. Do have a couple of other issues before this hour is up. I thought I might want to talk briefly about the fact, for those of you in the state of Florida, you have a governor that said, you know what, I'm going to take on big tech, which has been kind of interesting. And even these last few weeks, we've had everybody from Glenn Greenwald, more recently David Sachs. You might say, well, who's David Sachs? Oh, he was the one that gave us PayPal, but has been very concerned about some of the things that are happening there. And so there's just a lot of issues surfacing right now that we can talk about. But Penna, you have written about the fact that there is no reason to keep the schools closed. The chances of an individual coming down with the coronavirus in a severe way who's a student is very slight. Even for most teachers, very insignificant overall. And yet we still have documented on a number of occasions that some of these school districts have kept the schools closed. Republicans in the Senate said, okay, we have an idea. Let's have an amendment that says we'll withhold federal dollars from schools that refuse to open. After all, if you're not going to actually convene school, then why should we actually send federal dollars there? It was shot down in a 50-50 party split. So you couldn't find one Democrat to say that's a good idea. All the Republicans did. But what about this whole issue of the schools?
It makes you wonder if Democrats and their staffs don't have kids that are suffering from having to stay home and do online school all these months, that that this was so partisan. But we talked a lot last week about the teachers' unions versus the student, and how, the students' interests are definitely being sublimated in some of these big cities to the interests of the teachers, or the unions, really, who don't want to return to in-person school until they put all these different requirements up, like everybody has to be vaccinated, or we have to prove that the vaccine stops transmission of the virus, whatever they want to put out there to make it harder and harder. And so I forget what it was called, but all these different amendments were being added to the relief bill, the stimulus bill, and they spent the whole night working on this,
yes,
considering all these amendments. And one of them was that an amendment to hold taxpayer dollars from schools that refused to go back and have and teach the students in the school. And of course, Biden is supposed to, in this $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, he wants $130 billion to go to the schools, which to me is amazing, because most of them aren't even teaching the kids at the school, that they need even more money than they've already got in the other three stimulus packages. But it's really become an excuse just to spend money and make government bigger and more responsible for everything that goes on. 8 Senate Republicans introduced this bill, including Senator Marco Rubio, and he said that the Democrats are anti-science and partisan because they're withholding support from both this amendment and this bill. And they're refusing to make it a priority to reopen schools, even though now we just have more and more evidence that community spread is not really affected by the schools. In fact, schools are a safer place to be. And even teachers are not getting the virus from kids to, any great degree where you would be justified in keeping the schools closed. And then Tom Cotton, the same brave senator, said the Democrats are ignoring science in favor of special interests, that being the teachers' unions. So, this was shot down. The Democrats axed it, but it was very close and 50-50. And it's another statement, and I think that's why the Democrats did this vote-a-palooza that took place all night, just to try to bring up some issues that are important to get them on the record and to show the American people where the Democrats versus the Republicans stand on some of these hot-button issues.
Talk about the special interest, Kelly, because that's what Tom Cotton said, that we're ignoring the science and instead special interests come first. What about that?
Well, we see it in a number of ways, but this is one of them. This is a deal where everybody knows what's best for the kids is for the kids to go back to school. And the science is saying that. And the people are saying that, but they can't do it because the teachers' unions have such a lock on the Democratic Party. When you go to the Democratic National Convention, typically 1 out of every 3 delegates is a teachers' union person. So this is, the other thing that reminds me of this is school choice. The Democratic Party likes to pretend to be for, Black Americans. But the biggest issue to people in the inner cities and Black Americans often is school choice, to have great education choices for their kids. But the Democrats are always against it, not because the people are against it, but because the teachers union. So I think this is a really difficult issue for the Democrats, and the Republicans would be smart to play this because most Americans understand the kids need to be back in school. The CDC said, what was it, a month ago? The safest place for a child to be is at school because the kids aren't transmitting. You're much more dangerous at home, or anywhere else. The transmission is not occurring amongst young people. And so if you want to do, and plus all the negatives from the kids being away from school, the increased suicides, I think I just saw locally in a school district, they just did a poll and 1 out of every 5 have just dropped out of watching any classroom instruction, anything. They're being set back for years to come. So everybody knows for kids, the answer is get them back to school. And so this looks really bad for the teachers' unions to be saying, no. Our, somewhat irrational needs are more important than the kids. We'll throw them overboard.
And I think parents are, across the nation are figuring out how important it is for kids to be in school. And there's a stat from the American Enterprise Institute, Frederick Hess, and he said that although primary and secondary schools get about half of local government spending, so your local taxes, about half of that goes to the schools. You probably know that. And the national average of that is about $14,000 per pupil. Only about a third of students nationwide are attending school in person each day right now. So all this money is going to the schools, and they want more. They want another $130 billion in this stimulus bill, and yet only a third of the schools are attending the school in person of kids.
And Penna asked questions earlier. What about these Democratic lawmakers and staffers? They have children, and I wonder if you did an analysis. I wonder how many of those children are in private schools, where they're in school in person.
And yet the Democrats fight like anything against school choice.
Yes.
Let's take a break. Just before we do so, we'll come back from the break, and we've got some questions that we will get into as well. Maybe you have some comments or questions about that. And this particular article, maybe we could even cite a little bit in just a minute from the Centers for Disease Control, American Academy of Pediatrics, but we have some questions about that, so we will take those phone calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Representative Dan Crenshaw started his commentary about lockdowns, but quickly focused on how our brains process risk. He wanted to help us understand why Americans see the pandemic and the lockdowns very differently. He cites research that discovered that Democrats and Republicans differ in their neural mechanism activated during risk-taking exercises, specifically in the amygdala region. This demonstrates measurable physiological differences when confronted with risk. For example, conservatives overwhelmingly fill the ranks of physically riskier jobs such as the military, law enforcement, and loggers. What does this mean in terms of the pandemic that we faced this last year? Well, conservatives are less risk-averse to physical threats and less likely to favor more extreme actions to mitigate risk. Liberals, he argues, are more likely to believe that government can solve problems and are willing to accept such measures. He also quotes from research by Dr. Jonathan Haidt, who's been on my radio program to talk about his latest book. He found that liberals overemphasize caring and fairness above other moral considerations. Conservatives favor these moral categories, but also value moral authority and tradition, liberty, and loyalty. And this also explains why liberals routinely denigrate contextualized COVID-19 data, such as accounting for age and comorbidities when assessing fatalities, because they see this as downplaying the virus. If we're to have a civil debate about the responses to the pandemic, then we need to understand the differences between us and frame the discussion accordingly. Representative Crenshaw wisely reminds us that some of the differences we have about government policy are affected by how our brains process risk and emotions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, the number is 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford. Let's head out to Arizona, KNLB. Gene, thank you for calling today.
Hi, how are you today?
Very good. What would you like to add to the conversation?
Well, I just had a question because I have an elementary school kid. And you guys were talking about how there's evidence that school spread isn't a huge part of why COVID's going through the communities. I want to know where that evidence is so that I can read up on it and decide if it's safe to send my kid back.
Good question. Yes.
Centers for Disease Control has been citing that evidence. So I think if you went to their website, you'd find the studies.
What I thought was so interesting is that the incoming CDC director, her name is Rochelle Walensky, Dr. Walensky from Harvard Medical School, and actually a Biden supporter, obviously, but she even said that teachers themselves do not need to be vaccinated in order to return to in-person learning. So that was kind of interesting. There was a study also from the American Academy of Pediatrics that schools can stay open safely in communities with widespread community transmission. Other studies, again, have shown that schools are not driving this coronavirus infection rates. As a matter of fact, she was talking about having elementary age. That's even safer. It's almost like the younger you are, the safer you are. And Kelly, you had a piece that went to the Supreme Court, which I think wasn't it the phrase that the safest place for students is in the schools?
Yeah, there had been a lot. The CDC is updating these studies all the time. I think the new incoming head of the CDC for the Biden administration just within the last week said that it not only was safer for kids, but it was actually so safe that teachers could come back without being vaccinated. So this is all recent, and she was basing that on even more studies that are coming forward. But even by December, we had a case on behalf of Christian schools and the ability of them to open, and we cited to the Supreme Court. The CDC had already said in December that the safest place for a child to be was in a school. That's the least likely place that they would have transmission, and they don't get it like adults do, and they don't transmit it like adults do. So it's actually safer for them to be at school around kids. And if you'll remember, that's when Anthony Fauci even publicly said, close the bars, open the schools. So, I mean, the data has been out there. These were not from some American study either. These are from studies of many countries who were trying to figure out this, and everywhere. It didn't matter what country, what situation, it was safest for the kids to be at school.
Penna Dexter, I might also quote you for a minute, because your commentary that came out January 29th reminded us that, for example, when you look at Los Angeles, you look at Fairfax County in Virginia, even last week we were talking about something up in Baltimore, many of these have been closed down, and yet again, we can, as Kelly just mentioned a minute ago, you have these meta-studies where they're not just from one state, from one country, it's from multiple countries and multiple venues, in which we recognize that it's almost like the younger you are, the safer you are.
Yes. I mean, at the very beginning, of course, it was a complete opposite, but because we were worried about people giving it to the children, but the children seem to be, under this pandemic, doing the best. Just going back to sort of the rationale behind this, just one example, all the big cities where the teachers' unions have so much power, that's where this battle is. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's also a battle out in the suburbs, but in the big cities, the unions are digging their heels in. And in L.A., so the union there, the most powerful one there, has preconditions for its members returning to the classroom. And these are the preconditions. They have nothing to do with safety of the kids. I mean, one of them would be a moratorium on authorizing charter schools. Well, they don't want charter schools because it's too much competition for the public schools, for their public schools. They also want a state wealth tax. What does that have to do with safety of kids? They also want the police defunded. That has a lot to do with safety of kids. And they want Medicare for all. So these are the demands that the teachers' unions are putting forward for their teachers to go back and teach the kids in school.
Yeah, I think everybody understands what's going on now. You watch it's going on in Chicago. That's all over right now. They're in a big fight. You got the Democratic
strike.
What she said yesterday, the Democratic mayor there, is she said the people suffering the most are, as she said, our black and brown children.
That is so true.
This is disproportionately focused towards minorities. That are the ones suffering. But again, they don't care. This is not about the kids. There's not a single teachers union that is arguing that it's best for the kids not to be back at school. The only arguments they're making is it needs to be safe for them. And again, what that Biden, new head of the CDC, said is it's so safe that you don't even have to have a vaccine. So it is safer, but nothing is safe enough because they want to be paid to not work. And again, there are special situations where somebody would say, hey, I've got somebody in my family where if I get it, I put them at danger. Well, you're probably more at danger where you're going now. Like, do you go to the grocery store? Do you go to, there's actually more people with the virus there than you'll ever find at your school with a bunch of kids who don't get it and don't pass it. So, again, it's like evidence versus the power of these unions.
One more point that you made just a minute ago, there was a study of nearly 4.4 million students, primarily black and Hispanic, so African-American, Hispanic-American, and they found in that study of 4.4 million students that are minority
significant declines in math scores because they're not there. And what we have found in some of the other research that we've documented here as well, the best and the brightest students, the ones that are already self-motivated or they have parents that motivate them, they're going to watch online and they're going to still probably pick it up. It's the ones on the other extreme where there aren't parental involvement or they maybe
Parents have to work.
Yeah, they're just simply not there. And the kids, after a while, they supposedly are online. But, you know,
the stats,
we all have had kids and grandkids. We know about this, right?
The stats that break my heart are the ones you see. Like I saw one for 10-year-olds. The suicide rate for 10-year-olds was increasing by 5 to 1. So this is... this is politics at its worst. This is where the people with the power, in this case the teachers' unions, unfortunately don't seem to care about what's happening to the children. And people have got to step up. They've just got to step up and say, we don't really care what you've got to say. We're going to go by the evidence, by the information, by what's best for these children. And again, I think this proposal is exactly right in the Senate. If you don't teach, then you don't get paid. The federal government should be sending no money to places where the science shows it's safest, and yet they refuse to do it. That's a pretty simple. That's the way everybody else. That's the way everybody who's listening. That's the way you would be treated in your job if everything was safe and that showed it was safe, and you refused to do your job.
Just going to the sectors that are the most likely to suffer. George Will points out in a column about this that summer, we have the summer learning loss. Every summer there's a learning loss. And already over the years, the stats show that children from less affluent homes with more single parents, fewer options of out of school experiences during the summer. So they lose the most, according to the tests and according to the statistics. Well, this is like summer all year. Mm-hmm. I mean, there is, the teachers will come back and say, well, we are teaching online. We have some teachers, we have some classes, but, and maybe, as you said, Kerby, if the parents are prodding them or if they're self-motivated older kids, they may be doing okay. But just think of little kids and being online for 3 or 4 hours at a time. I mean, it's just, it boggles the mind. If you know children, you just can't even imagine that would be a good thing. And I did note during the first few months of the pandemic in California, they published some statistics about the numbers of kids, high school age, who were even not logging in. They lost kids. They really had no. Maybe they've improved that part of it, but kids were not even logging in. They didn't hear from them from March through the end of the year.
That's sad. We need to take a break, but when we come back, I want to get into a couple of issues. One of the articles we've posted here is about election reform. First of all, we've got H.R. 1, which we can talk about, but then that would be a backlash and some of that. And then also, we talked last week about shorting stock and all the rest. It was kind of interesting because one of the founders of PayPal said, I see a similarity where after a while, Discord banned Wall Street bets because they didn't want them to actually have access to the market, and they accused him of hate speech when all they were really doing was raising the price of stock. And he said that sounded a little bit like, remember Parler and Amazon? And so you even have somebody with PayPal saying, sure, it looks familiar to something we've seen before. So we'll talk about that right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, Consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford. I want to talk about election reform for a couple of reasons. First of all, we need it. Second of all, it is kind of the basis of some of the conversation that will be surrounding the impeachment trial. And one of the articles we posted is about will Democrats' election reform push backfire on the dark money left? Because the argument being made by Jack Fowler is Democrats have really done well with dark money spending. But this article and even the conversation that we've had recently is about H.R. 1. And last year there was an H.R. 1 called For the People Act, and it passed the House of Representatives, didn't go anywhere in the Senate. So this time H.R. 1 is called the Democracy Restoration Act. And I thought, in case you're unfamiliar with that, let's see if you see any problems here, because it requires that all states have to have mail-in balloting. All states must have automatic registration to vote, which means you can register online on the internet. All states must have a period of early voting. All states must allow anyone to register the same day of an election. A state may not require, and I'm quoting from this right now, an individual to provide any form of identification as a condition of obtaining an absentee ballot. And if you like ballot harvesting, you'll have a whole lot more of it, because it says, quote, a voter can designate any person to return a voted and sealed absentee ballot to the post office, a ballot drop-off location, tribally designated building, or election office. Penna Dexter, what possibly could go wrong there?
Well, you know, when you mentioned automatic registering to vote, that means that if your name and address appears in any state or federal database, they can automatically be just registered to vote. That's what automatic register to vote is. Yeah. So, I mean, again, first of all, it's not great to, people ought to make some sort of an effort. But, yeah, and they also want to require ballot drop boxes, curbside voting. I mean, everything that is in here makes voting less secure.
Yes.
And, you know, when you have the mail-in voting, it's bad enough. But when you don't allow stringent requirements of comparing signatures and things, then that makes it even worse. So, you know, there's an agenda behind it, and the agenda is to make it totally nationally controlled and not allowing states to have their election laws and make them strong and abide by them, but make it a federal issue and make it very loose and very easy to manipulate an election.
Yeah, first, I think it's unconstitutional. Because the Constitution is very clear about the state legislatures controlling the modes and manners of the elections. But as a bill, it's one of the most outrageous and frightening things I've ever read. And you would think that means it's like, well, it's some nutty congressman that like him. It's H.R. 1.
And something very similar passed the House last year.
Yes, and if people don't understand this, it means that people can walk right in on the day of election, register, that the state is prohibited from requiring a registration like a week beforehand. Again, they can come right in, and the state is prohibited from asking for any ID or seeing any ID. So just think of it. You could go, hey, I think I'll vote at like 30 locations today. Okay, nobody can stop you. Nobody will know. No, I mean, you know, just add an extra, letter in the middle of your name, and you can just change your name slightly, or you can just come up with a different name and vote anywhere you want. If you vote illegally, you can't be prosecuted. That's another thing in the bill. So, if you come in and go, well, I didn't realize I wasn't supposed to vote twice, can't be prosecuted. No recourse against that. And then there's, in addition to all the, can't look at signature verification on the mail-in ballots, can't do all these things. In addition to all that, there's also provisions in this that force all the nonprofits to disclose who all their donors are.
Yeah. Oh, why did you bring that up?
Now, why would you want to do that? Well, you want to do that if you want to persecute those people that support anything, and so you can go after them. Again, that's also unconstitutional. We've had cases when they used to want to know who gave to the NAACP so that the Klan could go after the people who gave to them. The Supreme Court said you can't do that. Well, this whole bill is to really just destroy our elections and the ability of people to have any confidence in the elections. And the only way this passes is if they get rid of the filibuster, because it's not going to pass the Senate. It'll pass the House.
Unfortunately, probably will.
Unfortunately.
Yeah,
but it would never
time.
pass the Senate unless they got rid of the filibuster. But if they did, I know a lot of people that if I said their names here on the radio, people would say are very well-respected national people who have said to me that if this bill passed, our country would be over. That's how dramatic this bill is and how really outrageous it is. And I wish I could say, well, it has no chance, but it does. It's going to pass the House, and they're going to push for it in the Senate. But people need to see this. This is something everybody should talk to your congressman or congresswoman about, to your senators, and you should just let them know this is a horrible, horrible idea, as well as being unconstitutional.
I might just mention we are going to have an action item on that.
I had a feeling.
Our action item today is just where you can get the media bias booklet. But matter of fact, that's a good reason to get it now, because I think next week we're going to do an action item on H.R. 1, so that if you don't know your member of Congress, so we make it very easy. We give you some talking points, but I think you've already heard enough from Kelly to say this is crazy. And the fact that it passed last time, it was in a slightly different version, I'll admit. But nevertheless, I did a commentary a year ago on the For the People Act, which was then H.R. 1. This one's called the Democracy Restoration Act of 2021. But it's essentially the same bill. And it now that we've had a year of this, Penna Dexter, we know how all this can be used and misused and abused.
Well, it's interesting because I remember back when they had Prop 8 in California, which was to define marriage as a man and a woman, excuse me. And so this one executive from Mozilla, Brendan Ike, remember that? He gave $1,000 to that effort, and he ended up getting taken off out of the company, fired from the company that he founded, because he just had the gall to support marriages between a man and a woman, and somebody came up with his name on a list of donors.
Mm-hmm. It's now we'll say this will be a real test in the House. The Democrats barely, have the slimmest margin, I think, and I don't know, what is it? I don't know, 50 years, whatever it was. It's been a long time. Mm-hmm. So they have a very, very thin margin, and they're very well aware that in the upcoming election, the general tendency is for things to swing back pretty heavily towards the party out of power. So if you're one of those Democrats in those swing districts, and there's probably 20 to 30 obvious ones, do you vote for this? Because they couldn't just assure that you will not be back. So those people are going to have to make a decision here. And again, it only takes, 7? I don't know. Last I heard it was 7. I hadn't counted the numbers recently because there's some of these races that never end.
I know. That's right. They're still trying to solve one of them.
But so it doesn't take very many of these Democrats to where they can't pass this. So it is important. And when Point of View puts out the deal to call the representative, it will be important because there are Democrats who, might go with the Republicans on this. I'd say there will be a significant number. I wonder if it'll be a deal where Pelosi says, well, you can do it up to this point, but then we can't lose the vote. I can't imagine any Republicans who would vote for this, and I would think they're going to pick up some Democratic votes. It's just a matter of how much in the House.
That article I posted is where it might even be, if you will, a backfire, because there's some Democrats that say we've benefited from some of the dark money, if you will, some of the PACs and things like that. So it's possible, but it's just, again, one of those threats. And we've just been through this, Penna, and recognize what happens when you just mail out ballots and you don't know who gets them, and you don't require people to sign it, and we don't have voter ID. That's just a prescription for some kind of difficulty or even voting irregularity. Whether it's not voter fraud, it's certainly some voting irregularities.
H.R. 1 would be the wrong lesson to learn from the 2020 election.
And even if everybody did everything right, which I know none of us believe is what happens, the loser is going to look and say it was stolen.
Yes.
They're going to. It just hurts our country when people don't have confidence in the results and that those are the results. And so it's really important that we have an election integrity in a way that people can feel very confident that everything was done the right way.
Well, let's take a break. And one of the other articles we've posted, I think it's about the 4th article, Just something to think about because, after all, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, I think he's running for the presidency. I don't know. But nevertheless, it says, finally, a Republican leader declares war on big tech. And we've talked about that before, but I thought we might mention that because I see some connection between the censorship in big tech and even some of the things Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews and I talked about last week with the whole issue of Reddit and Robinhood and GameStop. It's kind of interesting to see all that playing itself out. So we'll be back right after this.
During the early shutdowns back in April, author J.K. Rowling released a children's novel in 3 installments for families stuck at home. She actually wrote the Ichabod during the years when she was writing the Harry Potter series. The full novel was published in November. The story begins when King Fred of Cornucopia allows 2 manipulative and power-hungry advisors to convince him to embark on a quest to kill the Ichabod, a creature most of his subjects consider imaginary. While some citizens deem this a pointless but harmless mission, others discover that by amplifying the threat posed by this mythical creature, they can rally the citizenry to achieve certain nefarious goals. They enact an Ichabod tax to defend against this terror and another tax to pay the tax collectors. These taxes harm smaller shopkeepers and poor cornucopians. The wealthy find ways to escape the damage. The clampdowns eventually tank Cornucopia's economy. Citizens who complain about the drastic measures taken to battle a creature whose existence they doubt are accused of treason by the king's ambitious advisors. Dissenters are imprisoned. The 2 heroes of the story, children named Daisy and Bert, are taken from their parents and placed in an orphanage where they are denied outside communication. J.K. Rowling made clear that the idea for this story came to her well over a decade ago, but it's uncanny how accurately it portrays the financial damage done by government-dictated lockdowns in response to COVID-19 to small businesses and their owners and employees. And Daisy and Bert's confinement to an orphanage speaks to the enormous educational and emotional toll the response to the pandemic has taken on children, even though they are the least likely to suffer from the virus. An article by Sarah Rinder in First Things highlights additional striking COVID-19 parallels in the Ichabod. J.K. Rowling herself says, it's a story about truth and the abuse of power. She certainly picked the right moment to release it. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you've listened to this program any length of time, we have certainly talked about the censorship of big tech. And a lot of that goes all the way back almost 10 years ago to when Craig Parshall was first talking about that when he was with the National Religious Broadcasters. So this isn't like a new issue. But Penna Dexter, one of the things I posted here was a very good piece by Liz Peck, or Peek, I guess is how she pronounces her name. Finally, a Republican leader declares war on big tech, and that has to do with the governor of the state of Florida, Ron DeSantis, who's proposing legislation that would have some stiff fines when tech companies deplatform. So nobody saw that coming, but I thought we'd post that article today, just let people know that some states are starting to say maybe there is something we can do about censorship.
So his bill would allow individuals and the Florida Attorney General to sue firms that violate the safeguards against privacy violations. Aren't we already suing them here in Texas? I think we might be. DeSantis, the governor of Florida, he suggested that there might be some other activities like colluding to ban people or companies from payment platforms. A lot of ministries have been subject to that, or from cloud services. These things could also be outlawed because we're starting to see companies, as you said, it's more of a corporate totalitarianism, excluding people that have certain beliefs from just even getting their services. And that could just begin, if that's allowed to continue and creep in, Christians would just be not able to operate within our society anymore. And so I think we have to be aware of those things, and DeSantis is stepping in his state to try to protect against that.
Yeah, it's what Penna's talking about. It's a real danger. I mean, with not allowing credit card processing.
There you go.
Like, I mean, this is not like a, point of view listeners think, well, it must be some really horrible group. Well, like it's already happened to the American Family Association.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, basically for holding traditional biblical Christian views, you can now say, well, I'm sorry, we're not going to run any of your credit cards. And this was Stripe, which is one of the biggest in the world. And same thing with banks. That, that's, if you'll remember what happened to the Benhams originally, when they were on TV for their Christian stance, you actually had banks saying, well, we're going to withdraw our banking relationships. So it's very dangerous. I appreciate what Governor DeSantis is doing in that he's at least being creative and trying to figure out a way, because I think the real answer to the big tech thing is I think they're monopolies. I think they're serious antitrust problems. I mean, as we've seen, what we really had happen with Parler was like a cartel. I mean, it was like Google, Apple, and Twitter all, teaming up together. I mean, all these groups, and Amazon,
Amazon Web Services.
Yeah, but I don't know that anybody can survive against them because they have totally monopolized the market in their perspective arenas. And so we're going to see, because I think they've given every incentive possible for something. I mean, I know how many people do you know that would love to have an alternative to all these things and go and do that? I mean, for instance, because of the Amazon server situation, that they have a third of the servers and that they just shut down Parler overnight, which is clearly abusive. My wife and I said, we're just not going to do business with them anymore. I mean, we're not going to order things through Amazon. We're just, we'll go to the local merchants. We'll order online through other people. And we've gotten around that. And I think you can do that if you're dealing with like ordering things, right? But if you're trying to, Google, when you're dealing with $1 trillion company, they're more powerful than almost every country in the world.
That's true.
And so that's a different story. But I like what DeSantis is trying to do. I don't know that it'll be constitutional.
Yeah, I wondered about that.
I mean, I think when you tell a private company or a private individual that they have to provide a platform for somebody's speech that they don't want, I mean, there's just a lot of difficulties. It's going to have to be worked out. I do think in the election context, there might be more power there. Because the idea that you can, sort of do things to throw the election one way or the other, and yet you're not. Really, what they're doing is they're giving in-kind contributions to certain parties and candidates over others, which really you could go after them criminally. So there might be some more leeway there, but I like that. Some of the states, I think this is going to have to, until there's an antitrust, these companies need to be broken into pieces, into different companies, so that they'll allow competition. But until then, I think the only answer is going to be the states.
Yes.
State attorneys generals filing lawsuits, states like DeSantis filing, coming up with laws that try to actually get control of this. Because otherwise, the consumer, the type of people that are listening to Point of View, none of us have the power to do anything about this. And this is the marketplace of ideas, and it's being destroyed. And so I appreciate governors who are trying to do something. And I think it's going to be up to them and these attorneys general in the short term to get anything done.
I thought I might just mention how quickly you can get pulled off the air. We talked about this the other day because you had Citizen Link, which is part of Focus on the Family. Now, well, you're talking about a group that's not all that political, especially once Dr. Dobson left, and not that political, but simply by having this statement, Dr. Levine, who is the Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services, Dr. Levine is a transgender woman that is a man who believes he is a woman. And that was enough to get you thrown off Twitter.
Yes.
That's just a statement of fact, but that was enough to be actually trigger a censorship that was taking place. And so, Penna, we recognize sometimes people say some pretty outrageous things on Twitter. You think? Of course they do. Yes. But when something that almost innocuous is enough to get you censored.
Something that true.
And it's factually true.
Yeah.
It gets back to this whole thing. Live not by lies. You cannot say lies. We have to say the truth, right?
We do. And think about this, though. Twitter saying, well, you can't say that, but the Ayatollah Khomeini can have an account and say that we need to exterminate the Jews. That's okay. And all the just grotesque, pornographic and I mean, the idea that these people are censoring this information because it violates some moral standard or some policy, it's a lie. They're totally inconsistent. They do not apply that same approach to it's clearly they don't like essentially the Judeo-Christian perspective and things that are more on the conservative side.
And they have favored candidates.
And they favored candidates on that same way. So it's just not truthful what they're doing. They're lying about what they're doing, and which to me makes them open. If these state attorney generals wanted to go after them for consumer protection violations because they say they're not doing what they're doing, I think they would be open to billions of dollars of damages and what they're doing to consumers all over the country. But I think the gig's up now. Everybody knows. It's just a matter of, are these people so powerful that nobody can do anything? And I think we're going to find out, because I think we've seen them, sort of force everybody into a corner. And people are trying. Parler's trying. All these other groups are trying to have a real platform for free speech, a real marketplace of ideas, which is what this country is really about.
Just before we run out of time, let's mention firstlibertylive.com. And this next week, if you want to learn about this push to try to increase the number of people on the Supreme Court, that's where they can sign up and then have a chance to watch that. And it's about the noontime hour, right?
It is. And they could subscribe where every time there's one of these interviews with top people like this, they can watch it live or they can watch it later, but it'll tell them at least so they know. So they can go to firstlibertylive.com and they can see the old videos there too, but sign up.
Very good. Well, thank you both for being here. I want to thank Doug for his help as the engineer and also for Steve for his help as the producer. And I hope you have a great weekend. We got a lot to cover next week, and we will see you back here on Monday right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information.